Welcome to CPF Firewire, a podcast from California professional firefighters where we discuss a wide range of issues affecting firefighters, our unions, our families, and the communities we serve.
Hello and welcome to the CPF Firewire. I'm the CPF President, Brian Rice. And for most of the last decade, our profession's been coming to grips with really a deadly health and safety crisis, suicide. And since 2014, the number of reported firefighter suicides in the U.S. has consistently exceeded traumatic line of duty deaths. And tragically, we're seeing the impact of this epidemic in the names being added to our California Firefighters Memorial. In California, we've led the way in recognizing the link between the job of firefighter and suicide. And we're one of the first states to recognize post-traumatic stress as a presumptive job-related injury. And this month, the California fire agencies are once again joining with employee groups in the suicide prevention and awareness stand down. So during the week of May 22nd through May 26th, you're encouraged to set aside time in the firehouse for training and exercises centered around behavioral health. And today on the Firewire, we get to reconnect with someone who is bringing suicide awareness training directly into the firehouse. Honored once again to have Alex Hamilton. Alex is a chief of the Oxnard Fire Department. He spent 18 years with the department, having previously served on the executive board of the Oxnard Professional Firefighters Local 1684. Alex brought a groundbreaking peer-to-peer suicide awareness training to Oxnard, and it's a program which is expanding to other agencies throughout the state. When we first spoke with Chief Hamilton in 2019, it was one of our most downloaded Firewire podcast episodes. And Chief Hamilton, Alex, we welcome you to the CPF Firewire again. It's good to see you, my friend.
Yeah, you too, Brian, and thank you. It's a tremendous honor to be sitting here and talking with you on this.
You know, let's do a refresher. Talk about your journey into the fire service, and particularly the California Fire Service, and just kind of walk us through and how you got here.
Yeah, so I spent a couple of years as a volunteer firefighter back in Australia, many years ago now, and loved it. And as a volunteer in a small rural community, it was nothing like a paid professional firefighter here in California. But I met my now wife in Australia. She grew up in Culver City in Los Angeles.
Oh, wow.
And so we ended up here, and as it turns out, Oxnard was actually the first job I applied for. Which something of a miracle, I know, and how competitive it is. So certainly I applied for other places, but ultimately Oxnard is where I ended up, which is fantastic for my wife because we're very close to her family. But ultimately, getting into the fire service, and then it sort of opened up this whole new world on all the opportunities that the fire service provides. But one of the things that was severely lacking for us, and I'm not sure if it's having parents as social workers as my background, but we just weren't taking good enough care of our folks, both in terms of after incidents, but also sort of preloading them and educating them on what behavioural health issues look like. And so as I got more involved, I got onto the executive board. I served 6 years as secretary-treasurer for 1684, through some pretty tumultuous times back then. And
I remember.
Yeah.
I think we were union presidents about the same time. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And so in my time there, we saw some folks with some significant issues that we really didn't handle well. I feel like both from the labor side or the management side. And so after a significant call that I had, it was actually Thanksgiving Day, it'd be 12 years ago this year, where it was a fatality, a pediatric fatality, vehicle versus pedestrian. And so it impacted me pretty significantly. At the time, I just sort of sought out help for myself, but not really understanding that the firefighter I was with that day was also tremendously impacted. But it took a number of months before he came out, and he came to me and he says, I need some help. I don't know what to do. We didn't have any resources set up. And that was sort of that oh shit moment where we need to do something.
Once you realized that there's a void, the services aren't there. Pick up the story. What did that journey kind of look like for you? And since the last time we talked, there's been a lot of changes.
Absolutely.
And I want to work our way to that.
Yeah, no, there has been a fantastic or a very positive pendulum swing in the right direction. But no, so when we decided we needed to do something, and it was the executive board that was really, we have to do something here. Thankfully, the management team that was in charge at Oxnard at the time really didn't have any answers, so we're quite happy for us to sort of take the lead. And at first, I think I felt like I was going to try and fix what we had, which really wasn't much. It was a sort of a poorly implemented CISM program. And then the more research I did, I reached out to the IFF. They are actually looking at creating what is now their 2-day peer support program. We were able to get some grant money out of the Assistance of Firefighter Grant Program. Mm-hmm. And so all these things sort of started to come into alignment. And so Oxnard was actually the IFF guinea pigs for their 2-day peer support program. Yeah, so Frank Lito and Pat Morrison and I know there's plenty more people that I could mention.
Those are kind of the godfathers of this whole movement.
Yeah, and so they came out and we did a sort of a trial 2-day training. They've changed that course over time, and it's just getting better and better. But that we went down that road, and then the other thing because that was just a small piece of that peer support, and because we had issues with suicide attempts within our agency, we knew we needed to address that too. We wanted to make sure in starting a peer support program, we really wanted to make sure that we gave everyone the tools to be comfortable in that space. And so we actually first heard about the LivingWorks tiered program of tiered suicide prevention. It was actually from FDNY. And we just took that to the next degree in actually implementing the different layers of suicide prevention that the LivingWorks model offers. So everyone would receive the 3 hours of suicide awareness training, and then our peer support folks would get 2 days of intervention training.
How much of that training how many firefighters have you delivered that training to over the course of time? And just a guess.
Yeah, so we're teaching tomorrow and Friday here in Sacramento, and I think that'll take us over 450 since we started in the 2-day intervention program.
That's 450 trained folks out there that strengthen our net. Talk about being a firefighter and the heightened risk for either post-traumatic stress injury that can lead to a number of things, including suicidal thoughts.
I think the game's changed when it comes to the fire service, and I think our folk, while we've hired thousands of new firefighters, we haven't expanded the ranks as much as call volume and things like that have increased, and certainly going through the last 4 years since we last spoke. And so I feel like our folks are getting exposed to a lot more frequently, and so there's not an opportunity for their brains to sort of off-gas some of this stuff and reconcile what they've gone through, and that's where I think we're starting to see some of these increases in PTSD and things like that. But also, hopefully, it's through greater awareness, and rather than sort of burying some of these symptoms, people are actually seeking out help.
Right.
But I think one of the things that makes the profession of firefighting a little bit different. There's been an increase in suicide throughout the general population over the last 15 years, other than a small dip during the pandemic. And so there's this theory about, they call it the interpersonal theory of suicide, where it's this idea of being a burden, coupled with the risk of not feeling like you belong. Mm-hmm. And then the third risk, and when these three risks come together, but the third risk is the capability for suicide. And so the way this model works is when these three risks come together, it ends up, that's when you at a much greater risk of suicide. I feel like for firefighters, that last risk, that capability for suicide, is where things are a little bit different for us, because when we talk about capability for suicide, that comes from sort of you getting desensitized to pain, is one of those issues, and then sort of an increase in fearlessness. And so I think those two pieces.
Talk a little bit more, expand on the desensitized.
Yeah, so I being exposed to as much terrible things that firefighters are on calls, I think creates this this sort of insensitivity. Call it maybe burnout might be another way to describe it, but that gets you further down that road towards sort of a heightened risk of suicide. And I think that's the difference between firefighters and the general population, is that desensitization that gets you closer to bringing those other two risk factors together.
I look back at my own career, and professionally I wouldn't change anything. I love what I did. I might have done a little bit more OES assignment, but I've always landed on, if I could change one thing, how could I have gone through that and not let my desensitivity to events go home with me?
So in the IFF resiliency program that started a couple of years ago, it's a one-day class. It's one of the IFF classes that I also teach, and so we talk about that. This idea of needing to be able to sort of put a wall up, a compassion wall or empathy wall up when we're dealing with calls and dealing with some of the craziness that we deal with, but then having the ability to be able to bring that back down again is really the key for firefighters to live well and live healthy. And so being able to connect with family, and so without that, because what it does, by putting that empathetic block up, then it does lead to those other two issues where you start to feel like you don't have that same sense of belonging because you have this wall up, and then some of those this issue of a burden, or it sort of gets to creep in where people would be better off without me, maybe because of these other issues, and because you're having that wall up, you're not connecting at home and things like that. So then it sort of can exacerbate all of these issues.
We think we're the only ones. And you can be in a firehouse with 10 people, 12 people, 3 people, 4, it doesn't matter. But most of the time we go through our day with the things that affect us, and it's all in here, and we think we're the only ones, and just having that conversation changes things.
Without a doubt, and it does. And I think one of the things too that is worth pointing out, that it's really difficult when you talk about risk factors when it comes to suicide. It's really difficult to talk about risk. It's really difficult to quantify, because ultimately we're still not very good at deciding who's at risk or who's more likely to have suicide ideation, suicide behaviours. Screening tools only work so well. Like the research is there, and so when we talk about risk, I think it's important to give it context. So one of the risk factors they say is a previous suicide attempt. It puts you at greater risk for another suicide attempt, but then a caveat to that is that the research shows us that someone that's had a previous suicide attempt, 9 out of 10 of them will still be alive 10 years later. And 7 out of 10 of them won't make another attempt, right? And so you put a little context behind those numbers, and there's actually reasons to be optimistic. And I think that's where I don't want this conversation to be all about doom and gloom, right? And because there are plenty of reasons to be optimistic. And so when we talk about risk, I think what we need to look at is someone that's thinking about suicide. They're sort of stuck in this tension between reasons to live and reasons to die, and it's terrible turmoil to be in that place. But what the research does show us is sort of really focusing on those reasons to live, and sort of changing that giving people better reasons to live, I guess, more reasons to live, will have significant positive outcomes. And so now somebody in crisis will say, I don't see any reasons to live, right? But the thing if you look at it, it may not be a great analogy, but looking at it, losing a set of keys, right? The keys just didn't cease to exist. You've just lost them, right? And so in the same sense, when somebody's in that turmoil, they may have lost their reasons to live, but they're not gone.
Right.
And so, it's a matter of like, well, let's take a little bit of time and let's see if we can find those again. And so, and that's where I think we, sort of shift that conversation a little bit towards optimism.
Even talking about suicide, people killing themselves, it makes me, I'm just going to use the term flashback to the number of men that I worked with in my home local that I worked with. And, just the number's over 20, but just off the top of my head, I can name off 10, and half of those 10 I sat opposite a jump seat with. And for anybody out there, and especially new firefighters, this is an issue.
Yeah.
And it isn't, we finally figured out, don't hide from this, because it's not going away. And I want to talk about it in the context of, we just came through a pandemic. Thank goodness last year we had a fairly moderate fire season. We all know that can change. We go back to the Dixie, the car, the camp, the years where, we were stringing, the fire season essentially up until last year lasted 3 solid years. And what that means is we have members on the front line for days on end.
Yeah.
What do you think? I want to talk about the impacts of that and how we as firefighters, when we're into these mutual aid responses, can take care of ourselves.
When we look at risk factors for firefighters, not just when it comes to behavioral health, but with cancer and all kinds of things, sleep can do incredible things. And there is sort of this bi-directional relationship between sleep can improve symptoms for mental health, and then getting treatment for mental health issues can improve sleep. It sort of goes both ways, but sleep is one of those sort of underrated things. And it's very difficult for shift workers anywhere, regardless of what the profession is. As a shift worker, incredibly difficult to sort of maintain good sleep. And so I think that's an area that we could focus on in terms of wellness. But one of the other things I think to look at, I when I first started teaching this resiliency class, it was myself, a guy out of Wisconsin, and then a retired FDNY member. And so John Hemsley would talk about, a good predictor of how someone's going to cope with September 11th is to look at how they live their life on September 10th. Right. And so in terms of, if we can encourage our folks to live well, because I think there is this element of being a risk taker, and, we sometimes have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol and things like that. So, and we just need to acknowledge those things, but also work to living healthier, because it's going to just help when times get tough. And that not just in terms of eating right and exercising and watching your alcohol intake, things like that. But it is having solid relationships, solid social supports, good relationship at home. If you're not, like, marriage counselling is phenomenal to get yourself into a good place where you can communicate well and those kinds of things. So all of those pieces are going to help, particularly when our folks are being asked to do more than they ever have before. And you talk to some of the things that we've done in the last few years. Not only being at the forefront of the pandemic when it first arrived,
right,
and then setting up vaccination pods, and then like the fire services that has already been asked to do extraordinary things over the last 3 years in that endless wildfire season, to then come into this. It's enough to push anybody.
It's interesting. There's a lot of through the pandemic, I look back on it, and there's a lot that I just sit and go, I can't believe what we went through. But you and I know, and anybody that is on the job knows kind of the internal turmoil that we went through as professionals, whether you were directly impacted by COVID with deaths of either friends or coworkers, down to the treatment, the controversy. I look back on it and am pretty amazed at how we came out of it the way we did. It could have been a lot worse. And even with everything going on around us, it amazes me how firefighters respond. But it also makes me think, is there going to be some long-term mental health and physical health issues out of that period of COVID, because for us it's compounded.
Yeah.
You know, our fire seasons didn't stop, the incidents we go to didn't stop, and do we need to look at the aftermath of, I think, the last 5 years? For if you're a professional firefighter or a public safety officer, it's been a hell of a 5-year span. You know, we lost members. Since I've started with this job, we've had 2 fire captains shot and killed on active fires. And so the game has changed. We have mass shootings. We had here in Roseville just a week ago, a person went on a shooting spree. They shot a California Highway Patrol officers. The members at Roseville Engine 5 happened right in their backyard. They evacuated people and secured people, including the Highway Patrol officer that was shot within the fire station. We have a lot more happening to us professionally that I think I want to talk about that a little bit. What do we need to be doing? Because I think it might come home to roost on us.
Yeah.
I'm worried about it.
No, I agree. I think, thankfully, so some of this stuff, and I'm the eternal optimist. So some of the divisions, some of the animosity, and some of the temperature in those divisions, I really feel like has come down.
Gone way down. Yes.
Yeah, and so there's a great book by Sebastian Junger called Tribe, and he talks about for a fulfilling life you need community, competence, and autonomy. And when you look at what happened through the pandemic, where the community really got divided, where we lost a lot of autonomy, whether it's you're getting stuck at work, your family can't visit you, vaccine mandates, regardless of what side of that debate that you fall on, right? All those things. So it really started to impact. The one thing that we held on to throughout all of those issues was competence, in that the fire service is one area, one industry, one profession that is incredibly competent, and we do a phenomenal job in meeting the risks and the hazards that get thrown at us every day. But I think now that we're coming out of that pandemic, we are starting to see that sense of community and autonomy is starting to come back a little bit. So that's where I feel like temperature's coming down. To your point, though, I think one of the things that's come out of COVID that we really do need to address is the lack of mental health professionals, the availability of mental health professionals. In Ventura County, for example, we're looking at, we have an on-call clinician, Dr. Sharma. He's been with us for years and has been a phenomenal resource. But one clinician's, it's not a one-size-fits-all. We need to have more the ability for people to reach out to others if they don't want to see Dr. Sharma. And also he doesn't practice sort of marriage counselling. He doesn't work with children. And so we needed to add these components to it. Right. So we've sort of gone out to look what's available. There really isn't much available. And then who's going to work within the workers' comp system when there's all this paperwork you have to do, and you'll be lucky to get $120 an hour out of the system, when in Ventura County, at least, you can charge $250 an hour cash. And why would you do that? On some level, and I know we deserve, but I think the access to mental health services is incredibly important because of the work that we do.
Experience is important, but that culturally competent piece is critical. And going forward, that's where I'm going to draw on other people. Okay, this is what we've identified in this issue. What are we going to do to tackle this? Yeah. And
so a couple of points I want to make on that, because one, I think outside of the workers' comp arena, because that's a long term, that's going to take time, is getting a clinician that you can contract with locally, finding somebody, even bringing somebody up, like grab somebody coming out of school and bring them into the fold. And I'll tell you that the cost is, I have 120 sworn firefighters and an agency of 150 people in total. It cost me about $1,000 a month for Dr. Sharma's time. In a $40 million budget or whatever it is now,
it's money well spent.
It's a drop in the bucket. But the second point I wanted to make really quickly was because of the lack of mental health resources, that's what makes it so much more important for us to be talking to each other, for us to having these conversations, for our peer teams to be out there doing their work and having those conversations. And let's be real, talking about suicide and sort of exploring if you think somebody's at risk of suicide is an incredibly difficult conversation to have. It's anxiety provoking, but you can do it. We can all do it. And if you can get somebody that's willing to talk to you about it, the fact that they're talking is huge. And that's a huge win. And so just keeping that dialogue going, it is that important. But understand it. Yes, it will be anxiety provoking. Right. It's going to be uncomfortable, but it's okay.
You know, even if you're not a peer supporter, you could find yourself in a position where you see something, you notice something, you feel a need to at least speak to a person that appears to be kind of in a danger zone. We all know when we find ourselves in a position where we found a coworker or a friend at risk. We know it. You feel it in your gut. Don't bypass that.
Yeah.
What do you do? And that's what I would like you to talk a little bit more about.
There's two sides to that I'd like to get to, but most basically, when we're talking about warning signs, it's what people like, what you see, what maybe you hear they say, what you sense about their actions and what they're doing, or maybe you learn things from other people that they're having a hard time at home, or you know the wife just asked them, their spouse has asked them to move out, or whatever it may be, and so those kind of pieces are the things. So what you see, hear, sense, or learn, the four basic things can be an opportunity to have a conversation. And when having that conversation, it is awkward, but if you're coming from a place of caring, it's hard for somebody to sort of react in an angry way to you or sort of push you away, because and so if you can use those things that you've seen or heard or sensed or learned to have that conversation, right? Hey, I've noticed that, you know, in our agency, we call it the dorm ninja, right? Where you're in your dorm all day. So, you know, notice you've become a bit of a dorm ninja recently. Like, you know, you're not participating in morning muster. Like, I'm noticing these things, and maybe they're not great examples, but I'm noticing these things. This could mean that you know, maybe you're thinking about suicide. Are you thinking about suicide? You know, it has to be a clear ask. Like once you have that spidey sense, that hair on the back of your neck, once you have that feeling, it's really important that you ask the question, and it has to be a clear ask, right? Asking, you know, are you going to hurt yourself? Most people are thinking about suicide are thinking about ending their suffering, so they could quite honestly answer that question: no, I'm not thinking about hurting myself, right? I'm ending suffering, you know. And you're not thinking about doing anything stupid, are you? Right? That's you're putting judgment on the turmoil that they're in. And so those things, and that's where it needs to be literally, are you thinking about suicide? If you can't say suicide, and we see this when we teach these classes all the time, it's a hard word to say. Are you thinking about killing yourself? It really needs to be that direct, and yeah, it's anxiety provoking, but you got to ask the question. Yes. And then it's a matter of, do they depend on how they respond. But if they say yes, and they are thinking about suicide, you just crack the door open to be able to have a broader conversation that can ultimately save a life. The other thing that I think it's really important to mention, because so many times we look back and we think we've missed something. You know, you miss that invitation, you miss that warning sign, and it can absolutely happen. I know a guy that I worked with, and I spoke to him 2 days before he suicided, and I struggled going back on that conversation and trying to think if I'd missed something. I don't know, honestly. I can't tell you for sure whether or not I missed something, but I'll tell you that one interaction that individual had on the day he suicided was he ran into a friend of his on the street, just a random interaction. These two guys had known each other for 50 plus years, had a small talk conversation. At the end of that conversation, this individual says, "Hey brother, I love you," as they're going their separate ways. The guy said at the time it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, but he never made that connection. And would somebody make that connection, right? Like people, those warning signs can be really subtle, really difficult to pick up, and then difficult to connect with suicide. And I say that because there's plenty of folks that are going to be listening to this that have probably tried to help somebody that ultimately suicided. There's probably plenty of people that maybe thought they missed something, and I want them to know that risk of like your suicide risk can change dramatically, right? From only sort of thinking about it in the background to suicide behavior in as little as 6 hours. And so that means that it's very difficult for somebody to be able to intervene, to be able to save that life. And so people that feel like they missed something or they should have done more, and they need to understand that that's not often not the case. And given an opportunity, if they'd been able to spot it. So I want people to know that it's not all on them, and they shouldn't be owning that feeling, because it is so difficult to make that connection, particularly when you've got to have this awkward conversation. And so it's important. One of the things I did want to touch on is the IFF. If for folks, locals that have had that 2-day peer support training program, there's an online training that the IFF offers. It's safety intervention planning for suicide, and essentially it's sort of the next step in suicide prevention. I think clinicians would call it crisis response planning. And so it's basically giving people tools when they get into a crisis to be able to help themselves, right? To be able to get themselves through a crisis. Because what we see when it comes to suicide risk is those feelings can build up, and maybe you get to a suicide behaviour, or maybe it'll dissipate back down again, and there's no suicide behaviour there. That IFF program is designed to sort of get you through that rising level of suicidal thoughts or ideations before you get to a behaviour. And so it is a really neat training. It's a 2-hour online training after you've taken peer support program through the IFF. I think that's another really good one that hasn't had a lot of people. I think we've had 10,000 people go through the IFF peer support training now, and only about 500 have taken this safety intervention training. So it's something that we could definitely add, just another tool in the behavioural health toolbox.
When you were talking, one thing that kind of struck me, because I never really thought about it, I always thought, if a person's thinking about killing themselves, it's a process they've taken upon themselves that I always looked at it as it lasts a long time. And something that you just said was it can elevate and dissipate in as little as a few hours. I never thought about it like that. I always thought that I had my preconceived notion on how a person could find themselves there, and you just made me wake up to that's not always the case.
Right. That
sometimes like you get an acute onset.
Yep.
It can be the same thing. I didn't really realize that.
Yeah, absolutely. In the same way, you can get into a bad mood. You don't stay in a bad mood forever, right? And you can have something that happens that'll put you in a bad mood very quickly, right? It works somewhat the same way. It may not be a good analogy. One of the things I think, though, that we also need to acknowledge is when we talk about access to lethal means, right? So and means restriction, and this has nothing to do with the Second Amendment. I'm not talking about gun control.
No.
But we need to acknowledge that suicide by firearm makes up half of all suicides, and suicide by firearm makes up 2/3 of all firearm deaths. It is a big number for us, right? And guns are lethal more than 90% of the time, right? It's an incredibly lethal method, and that's why I preface it with don't want this to be a Second Amendment conversation, no. But I know every single gun owner listening to this would want to do everything they can to avoid an inadvertent injury or death.
Absolutely.
From owning guns, and so that piece is something that we need to address, and so in your own jurisdictions, what happens if you have a member in crisis, and where can they store their firearms? Like, would you be comfortable taking them? And which is great if you are, but remember that at some point they're going to want those guns back, and so you need to sort of look forward a little bit. But also there are some great work with your law enforcement partners. Often people that are in crisis don't want to involve law enforcement, so then it's gun ranges, gun shops will often store Firearms.
I didn't. Interesting.
Yeah, and so if you have a local gun range or gun shop, go speak to them. Will you guys store these firearms for us if we have a member that needs them stored temporarily? And then in the home, and I'm sure everyone does these things, but keeping the weapons unloaded, keeping them in gun safes, these very basic means can do a lot to sort of lower that temperature.
So, Alex, we talked about the awareness and the fact that, maybe as a firefighter, you see something in the station, you approach a member and a coworker, and you talk to them about it, and you might diffuse the situation there. Or they might have thoughts that require more help than you're in a position to give. Let's just say you're a firefighter, you have awareness, I ask the questions, I've got an answer that I know I need to get more help. What do I do? What should I do to help this person get from point A to point B?
That's a great question, and a really important one too, because once you've identified that and identified that need, it is incumbent to get them to a resource. Now, what does that look like in your jurisdiction? And that's something that there are resources out there. Even if your agency currently has nothing in place, I guarantee you there's resources in your community. And so the simplest and easiest one is calling 988 if you don't have any resources, right? That's the new 3-digit number for the suicide prevention hotline. I have used it before. You can put the phone on speakerphone with you and that individual right then and there and talk through stuff. That's a most immediate Band-Aid if you've got nothing else to use. But otherwise, it's getting them in touch with the peer team. Peer teams exist as a bridge to other resources, right? That's literally their function.
Right.
And so if you can get them to the peer team, but it can't be like, hey, this is my buddy, he's on the peer team, call this number, right?
It's got to be a positive introduction.
And it has to be a handoff, right? Almost a physical handoff because you don't want to be walking away and like, hey, John over here is having this issue and so I need you to talk to him. It's like, hey, John, I need you to come with me and we're gonna get to this peer team because I want to keep you safe. I care about you. And that's where we need to get people. And keep in mind that if you have no experience in doing this and this feels really uncomfortable, the fact that they're talking to you means that you're winning right now.
Yeah.
And keep doing that. Get them to resources because again, the vast majority of people, when they're in that space, you can bring them back down again.
That open acknowledgement and talking about it, and over the course of my career, I have realized is a very big deal to a person that's having a crisis. If your department has an EAP, whether it's your local or partner up with a labor management, behavioral health, however you do it, call them. It is amazing what is offered and what kind of help you can get. And the more you interact with them, the better service you're going to get. And it takes away that other stigma, I guess. But positive handoff and that acknowledgement is a very big deal.
Yeah. One other thing, I know we're short on time. One other thing I really just wanted to touch on is to acknowledge that we're not going to save everybody. Mm-hmm. And that's just an unfortunate fact that we have to live with. But with that in mind, research tells us that for every suicide, it impacts about 135 people on average. I would argue for a firefighter, that number is likely exponentially higher. So what I would encourage those listening, either labor leaders or chiefs that are listening, get your post-vention resources together. Have things ready. Maybe as a part of this suicide safety stand down or mental health awareness stand down this month, the labour and management groups of agencies can look at putting those resources together, right? Like just have a post-vention policy. What are you going to do? There's great handouts on the IFF behavioural health page about how to talk about a firefighter suicide. Just start there. You don't even have to do anything. Just pull that down and have it with you somewhere handy in case you need it. But there are some really good resources to use to actually build a policy and be ready for what may happen, so that you're not playing catch up if it ever unfortunately happens.
And so you just mentioned this month CPF and Cal Chiefs. Again, we're asking departments to participate in our annual suicide prevention and awareness stand down. How important do you think this type of an event is to all of our members, and including members that are struggling?
Crucial. And I hope that people listening to this and really thinking about this and thinking about how they can approach it, company officers in the station, like how are you going to have this conversation? And I think we also need to acknowledge that, again, research tells us that at any given time, 5% of the population is thinking about suicide. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a good number of people listening to this, so there's going to be people listening to this that are likely thinking about suicide. And all I would say is I sincerely hope that you're visible to those around you, because you do have a community, you do belong. And
repeat that again, because you're really what you just said, Alex, is super important. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I really want to reiterate it. There's potential that we have members listening in right now that are struggling with that, and I want you to speak directly to them.
Yeah, and again, I will say that you are important, and I hope that you're visible to those around you, because there are people that care for you. Please, if you can, and I know it's incredibly difficult when you're in crisis, reach out for help. If you're not visible and people can't see your turmoil, please reach out for help. 988 is just a perfect place to start if you don't feel like you can actually have that first conversation.
Alex, Chief Hamilton, it has been a pleasure and an honor to have you with us today on the Firewire. I know for a fact that the work that you're doing has saved lives, and it will continue to save lives. And I truly appreciate your members, the Oxnard Firefighters and the city of Oxnard, allowing, and not just allowing, supporting you in this arena that is it's life and death for us. And I'm very thankful and grateful to you, the Oxnard Fire Department, the Oxnard Firefighters, and the time that you're allowed to take to really make an impact for all of our members across California. And brothers and sisters, you don't have to suffer in silence. The job takes a toll. Nobody gets out of this unscarred. And the other one, you are not alone. And if you need some help getting through a difficult time, there are resources that are available to you. And we encourage all departments and labor unions to participate in this month's Suicide Safety Stand Down. If you feel like you're in crisis, call someone you trust or call the National Suicide Hotline. Alex mentioned it a number of times, 988. That's 988. This is CPF President Brian Rice, and thank you for listening today.
You can find CPF Firewire at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, or wherever you find podcasts. Be sure to subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. You can also find CPF Firewire at the CPF website, www.cpf.org, and on the CPF YouTube page. We're always interested in getting your feedback, comments, and criticism. Tell us what you'd like to hear about. Drop us a line, info@cpf.org. CPF Firewire is a production of California Professional Firefighters. Our producer is Carol Wills. Our engineer is Matt McDermott. Please join us next month for another edition of CPF Firewire.